The sound came first. A dry, papery rattle like 1,000 whispering fires. It was a sound that belonged to drought and judgment, and it scoured the August air, making the teeth ache. Below, in the valley, the fields of good barley and ripening corn belonging to men who knew better were dissolving under a shimmering brown tide. The sky was not blue, but a greasy, seething gray, thick with the bodies of 1 billion grasshoppers. They covered everything, a living blanket that devoured the world. But here, on Elspeth's Ridge, the sound was different. It was the whisper of the plague, yes, but beneath it was a frantic, gobbling joy. Her 250 turkeys, the town's running joke, were in paradise. They stormed through the tatters of her own failed barley, their wattles shaking, their strange reptilian heads darting down, again and again, snatching the destroyers from the air, from the stalks, from the cracked earth. They were not birds. They were a counterplague, a hungry, feathered answer to the sky's curse. Elspeth stood by the fence post, her hands resting on the rough wood, and watched the arithmetic of her own survival unfold. The whole county was breaking, and her flock, her great foolishness, was getting fat. 3 months earlier, this had all been unthinkable. 3 months earlier, she was just the widow a year over, clinging to 30 acres of land that was mostly rock and regret. The land had been her husband's pride and his undoing, a place he'd bought with the last of his savings because the view reminded him of a home he could never see again. It was poor soil, thin and unforgiving, and the barley she'd planted after he was gone was a pale, spindly thing, more weed than grain. The town of Promise saw her predicament with the kind of pity that feels sharp to the touch. They saw a woman alone, too young to be so burdened and too stubborn to accept it. Mr. Gable, who owned the grain elevator and held half the mortgages in the county, had been the first to offer his counsel, which was his word for an offer. He'd stood on her porch, his hat in his hands, but his eyes on the deed box she kept on the mantel. "A woman can't work a place like this on her own, Elspeth," he'd said, his voice a smooth balm of condescension. "It's no shame. Sell it to me. I'll give you a fair price, enough to see you settled proper in town." A fair price was half what it was worth, and they both knew it. She had refused with a quiet shake of her head that made his lips thin. The other townsfolk were kinder, but no less certain of her failure. Their advice was a constant, gentle pressure to give in, to admit the land had beaten her as it had beaten her husband. Every trip to the general store was an exercise in smiling through a chorus of concerned suggestions. Their faces told her she was a ghost already, haunting the memory of a failed dream. She knew the arithmetic. The barley wouldn't fetch enough to cover the seed loan from Gable, let alone the taxes. Winter was a fixed point on the horizon, a certainty of cold and hunger. She would sit on her porch in the evenings, the ledger open on her lap, the columns of debt stark in the fading light, and feel the weight of being one person alone. It was on one of those evenings, staring at the useless whisper of her barley field, that the idea came. It was not a lightning strike of genius, but a slow, creeping thought, born of desperation and the memory of her grandfather's stories from the old country. A thing is only worthless if you use it the wrong way. The turkeys were a miserable lot. They belonged to a farmer south of town who was selling off his stock after a bad year. They weren't the broad-breasted whites that brought good money. They were a scruffy heritage breed, all leg and neck and suspicion. They were runners, not walkers, with an unsettlingly intelligent gleam in their black bead eyes. No one wanted them. They were known to be difficult, prone to wandering, and possessing a gaminess that town palates had forgotten how to appreciate. When Elspeth rode her cart down to the man's farm and made an offer for the entire flock, he looked at her as if she'd offered to buy his debts. "All of 'em?" he'd asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her wagon wheel. "Ma'am, they ain't worth the trouble of countin'." "I'll give you 10 cents a bird," she'd said. It was most of the cash she had left, a small roll of bills kept in a tin box. The man laughed, then saw the look on her face and stopped. He counted them out, 253 birds. He took her money and helped her herd the chaotic, gobbling flock back toward her ridge, a task that took the better part of the day and drew stares from every farm they passed. The news of her purchase reached Promise before she did. It was the final piece of evidence the town needed. Poor Elspeth hadn't just failed, she'd gone mad with grief. To buy useless birds to put on a useless field was a kind of poetry of failure. Gable didn't even bother to hide his smirk when he saw her in the street the next day. "Turkeys, Elspeth? I'd heard, but I didn't want to believe it. You'd have done better to buy a shovel and dig a new well. At least that'd be useful." She met his gaze with a stillness that seemed to unnerve him more than any argument could have. She just nodded, as if he'd given her a piece of sensible advice she might consider later. Her silence was a closed door, and the town learned not to knock. Only Old Man Hemlock, her nearest neighbor, saw it differently. He was an immigrant from a country of stony hills and hard-won harvests, a man who saw the world through older eyes. He came over the day after the turkeys arrived, leaning on the fence that separated their properties. He watched the birds for a long time as they nervously explored their new pen. They were a frantic, noisy mess, a collection of angles and squawks. "They are ugly things," he said at last, his voice a low rumble with the accent of his homeland. Elspeth, who had been mending a harness strap, looked up. "They are that." "Ugly things must work harder to prove their worth," Hemlock continued, his eyes still on the flock. "They must find the food others miss. They must be clever. It is the same with land, and sometimes with people." He turned to look at her, a real smile cracking the weathered landscape of his face. "The land does not waste, Elspeth. Only men do." It was the first time in a year anyone had spoken to her without a note of pity in their voice. He was not offering advice or condolences. He was stating a truth, as if she were a fellow farmer discussing the weather. That evening, as the sun set, Elspeth stood before the gate that led from the turkey pen to the field of thin, failing barley. The birds milled behind her, a restless sea of feathers. The arithmetic was simple. She could not afford to buy grain to fatten them. The barley was not worth the cost of hiring a crew to harvest it. But the barley field was not empty. It was full of weeds, beetles, slugs, and grasshoppers. It was a buffet, if you knew how to eat it. She took a deep breath, slid the bolt, and swung the gate wide open. The town's reaction was immediate and absolute. She had destroyed her own crop. It was one thing to make a poor investment, another entirely to commit an act of such blatant self-sabotage. Word passed from farm to farm, carried on waves of shocked amusement. She had turned her turkeys into her barley. It was a scandal of incompetence, a story that would be told in the tavern for a month. To Elspeth, it was simply the next logical step. The turkeys, hesitant at first, poured into the field like a feathered river. For a day they were a chaotic force, trampling the weak stalks and gobbling the seed heads. From the road, it looked like pure destruction. But Elspeth watched from the porch, and she saw a different story. She saw them ignoring the barley after the first hour, their attention turned to the ground. They moved in a broad, shifting line, their heads down, their powerful legs scratching at the soil. They were tilling. They were weeding. They were eating every beetle, every slug, every fat green worm that had been preying on the barley's roots. They were feasting on the competition. Day after day, she let them out at dawn and penned them back at dusk. The work was methodical, a rhythm that settled into her bones. She hauled water, mended fences, and spent hours just watching. She learned the flock's own language, the sharp alarm gobble that meant a hawk overhead, the low, contented purr of birds dusting themselves in the sun. She learned their economy. They were converting things no one else valued, weeds, insects, spilled seed, into muscle and fat. And they were fertilizing the field as they went, their droppings working back into the tired soil. One afternoon, a boy appeared at her fence line. It was Finn, the blacksmith's youngest, a scrawny 10-year-old with eyes that missed nothing. He didn't say a word for the first hour, just watched the birds with a silent, intense focus. "That big one," he said finally, pointing a grimy finger. "The one with the crooked feather in his tail. What's his name?" Elspeth, who had not considered naming them, paused. "He doesn't have one." "I think he looks like a general," Finn said with great seriousness. "General Sherman, because he's marching through the field." From that day on, Finn was a permanent fixture. He arrived after his morning chores and stayed until dusk. He had a solemn gift for naming. There was Mrs. Gable, a hen who was perpetually squawking and stealing food from the others. There was Preacher Ames, a Tom who puffed his chest out and strutted in pompous circles. He named all 253 of them, keeping a meticulous mental catalog. The boy's presence was a quiet comfort. He never asked why she'd done it, never questioned the logic. He simply accepted the reality of the field and its strange inhabitants. He saw what she saw, not destruction, but a system at work. He helped her patch the fence and haul the water, his thin arms straining, but his face set with determination. He was her first believer, and he didn't even know it. The townsfolk saw the boy's attachment as another sign of her strangeness, that she was drawing a lonely child into her folly. They did not see the purpose that was blooming in Finn, the way he stood a little taller, the way he spoke of the flock's health with the authority of an expert. He was learning the arithmetic alongside her, the quiet, steady calculus of turning nothing into something. The seasons turned toward summer. The sun beat down, and the barley stalks, long since trampled, bleached to the color of old bone. From the road, the field looked like a wasteland, a monument to a fool's decision. But the turkeys thrived. They were heavier, sleeker. Their feathers took on an iridescent sheen in the sun, greens and bronzes that hadn't been there before. They were no longer a scruffy, miserable lot. They were a flock with weight and purpose. Elspeth kept her success secret, like a coal banked low under ash. She knew that to speak of it would invite more scorn, or worse, a new kind of attention she was not ready for. Let them think she was failing. Failure was a kind of armor. It kept men like Gable at a distance. She continued her quiet arithmetic. 253 birds, gaining, by her estimate, a quarter-pound a week. That was over 60 pounds of meat being created from sunlight, weeds, and bugs. It was 60 pounds of grain she didn't have to buy. It was a winter's worth of food, a year's worth of taxes, walking around on 2 legs in her field. The numbers were a prayer she recited to herself in the dark. She weighed one of the smaller Toms one evening, luring him onto a livestock scale with a handful of corn. He was nearly 20 pounds. The breed was supposed to top out at 16. Whatever they were finding in the soil was richer than any grain. Gable stopped by one sweltering afternoon in July, his buggy kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on Elspeth's porch rails. He didn't get out, just sat there, looking from her to the field of ruin. "Still with it, I see," he said, a note of wonder in his mocking tone. "I'll give you credit, Elspeth. You're committed to your course." "It's my course to be committed to," she replied, not stopping her work of cleaning the water trough. "The offer on the land still stands. he said, ignoring her answer. "In fact, seeing what's become of the topsoil, I may have to revise it down a bit. But for your late husband's sake, I'll hold to the original price for another week." He was testing her, trying to find a crack in her resolve. He believed, as everyone did, that she must be on the brink of starvation, that her foolish pride was all that was holding her up. The truth was, she hadn't eaten this well in years. She'd roasted one of the younger birds the week before, and the meat was dark, rich, and deeply flavorful. Nothing like the pale, bland chicken sold in town. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice even. "But I'm not selling." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who understood numbers, and the numbers he saw here made no sense. A woman alone, a ruined field, a flock of useless birds. It should have added up to bankruptcy. The fact that it didn't was an offense to his understanding of the world. He flicked the reins and rode off, leaving her in a cloud of his disapproval. Later that week, young Finn ran up to the porch, his face alight with worry. "Mrs. Gable is sick," he announced breathlessly. Elspeth followed him to the flock, where a hen was indeed looking poor, its head drooping. Elspeth gently picked the bird up. It felt light. She had seen this before. She carried it back to the house, Finn trailing her anxiously. Inside, she mixed a mash of charcoal from the stove, cornmeal, and sour milk. It was an old remedy, another whisper from her grandfather. She fed it to the hen, who ate it weakly. By the next morning, the bird was back on its feet, squawking for its breakfast. Finn looked at her with a kind of awe. "How did you know to do that?" he asked. "You listen to what the world tells you," she said simply. "Sickness, health, it's all a kind of language. You just have to learn to read it." She was learning to read the language of her own small world, and it was telling her that she was on the right path. The first proof from the outside world arrived on the back of a broken axle. A carter, a man named Silas who hauled goods between the capital and the smaller towns, snapped his wheel in a rut at the bottom of Elspeth's road. It would be 2 days before the blacksmith in Promise could forge a new fitting. Silas was a large man with a larger appetite and a wagon full of inedible dry goods. He came up her path that evening, hat in hand, looking embarrassed and hungry. "Ma'am," he began, "I don't suppose you'd be willing to part with a chicken. I'd pay a good price. I haven't had a decent meal in a day." "I don't keep chickens," Elspeth said. "Only turkeys." Silas's face fell. "Ah, well, beggars can't be choosers. They look a bit lean, but I'll take one. How much?" Elspeth did the arithmetic. A bird was worth more to her as a walking asset than as a quick sale. But generosity had its own column in the ledger of the world. A man in need was a different kind of number. "You're stranded," she said. "It wouldn't be right to charge you. Take one as a gift, but you'll have to dress it yourself." Silas was stunned into silence for a moment. Then his face broke into a grateful grin. With Finn's expert help, he knew exactly which of the younger Toms was the right size. They cornered a bird. Silas was a professional. He handled the unpleasant business quickly and cleanly. That evening, the smell of roasting turkey drifted up from his camp by the road. The next morning, he was on her porch before the sun was fully up. His eyes were wide. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hushed with reverence, "I have been hauling goods and eating road food for 20 years. I have eaten in the finest hotels in the capital. That was, without exaggeration, the best bird I have ever tasted in my life. The flavor, it's like the earth itself. What in God's name are you feeding them?" "The earth itself, I suppose,"
Elspeth said with a small smile. "Just what they find in the field." Silas shook his head in disbelief. "Well, whatever it is, it's magic. When I get my axle fixed, I'm going to go straight to the head chef at the governor's hotel. He's always complaining he can't get true flavor anymore. He pays double for it when he finds it." He insisted on paying her, pressing a silver dollar into her hand, a coin worth 4 times what she might have gotten in town. "This is a deposit," he said. "When you're ready to sell,
You send word with any carter heading east. I'll see you get a fair price. A real fair price." He was true to his word. Before he left, he told the blacksmith about the bird. The blacksmith told his wife. The story circulated through town, but it was filtered through their established belief in her foolishness. They twisted it to fit their narrative. Poor Elspeth, so desperate she was giving away her stock. They didn't understand that the silver dollar in her pocket was not just money. It was validation. It was a message from the world beyond the valley, a world that judged a thing on its merits, not on the gossip of neighbors. It was the first crack in the wall of their certainty. She held the coin in her hand that night, the metal cool and heavy. It felt like a key. The arithmetic was changing. The numbers on her side of the ledger were starting to grow. The sky began to change in late July. The usual towering white clouds of summer vanished, replaced by a high, thin haze that did nothing to blunt the sun's heat. The air grew still and heavy, and a strange, expectant silence fell over the land. The birdsong seemed to quiet, and the nights were unnervingly calm. The creek that marked the southern edge of her property, usually a steady burble, shrank to a trickle, the stones of its bed exposed and baking in the sun. Old Man Hemlock stopped by the fence line more often, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. "Too quiet," he'd mutter, chewing on a piece of grass. "The world is holding its breath. When it breathes out, there will be trouble." He'd seen skies like this in the old country. They were, he said, weather breeders. They didn't bring rain, they brought plagues, fire or locusts. Elspeth felt it too, a low thrum of anxiety in the pit of her stomach. The turkeys sensed it. They grew restless, foregoing their afternoon dust baths to stand in silent groups, their heads cocked, listening to something she could not hear. The first reports were just rumors. Whispers passed from a traveler at the general store. A swarm of grasshoppers to the north, in the next county. A bad one, big enough to blot out the sun. The men in the store scoffed. There were always grasshoppers in a dry year. They were farmers. They knew how to handle pests. They had their new chemical dusts from the city, their modern methods. They weren't superstitious old men like Hemlock, reading doom in a clear sky. Gable was the most dismissive of all. "It's talk to drive up the price of grain," he declared to the men gathered on the store's porch. "Don't fall for it. The harvest is going to be a record one. I can feel it." But the whispers grew more frequent, more urgent. A farmstead 20 miles north was wiped out in an afternoon. A whole field of corn, gone. The sky to the north began to take on a dirty, brownish tint, even on the clearest days. The sound started a week later. It was too faint to be certain at first, a high-frequency hum at the very edge of hearing, the kind of sound you felt in your bones before your ears registered it. Elspeth would stand on the porch at dusk, straining to place it. It was the sound of 1,000,000 tiny wings, still a county away, but coming. The hum grew into a buzz, and the buzz grew into a roar. It was the sound Old Man Hemlock had been waiting for. The day it arrived, the air was so thick you could taste the dust. The roar became a physical presence, a pressure on the eardrums. Then, the horizon vanished. It was not a cloud. It was a solid, churning wall of brown that stretched from one end of the valley to the other, and it was moving with the speed of a freight train. The sun went out, not eclipsed, but swallowed. A greasy twilight fell at 2 in the afternoon. The world shrank to the confines of Elspeth's 30 acres. The plague had arrived. The swarm hit the valley like a tidal wave. It was a storm made of hunger. The noise was deafening, a monstrous, clicking, chittering roar that drowned out all other sound. The air was a thick soup of flying bodies that pelted the skin like hard rain. They landed on the roofs, the fences, the ground, covering every surface in a writhing, shifting carpet of brown. Down in the town, panic erupted. Men who had boasted of their modern methods ran to their fields to find their prize corn being stripped to the stalk in minutes. The leaves vanished, then the silks, then the tender kernels. The barley fields of her neighbors, the ones that had been thick and green and full of promise, were reduced to stubble. The chemical dusts were useless, a puff of white swallowed by an ocean of insects. It was a ruin so swift and so absolute it defied belief. But on Elspeth's ridge, something else was happening. As the first wave of grasshoppers descended on her blighted field, the turkeys, which had been huddled and nervous, suddenly erupted. A great collective gobble went up, a sound not of fear, but of ecstatic gluttony. They surged forward, a feathered army charging into the fray. Their heads darted, their beaks snapped. They were built for this. For months they had been training, hunting the native grasshoppers in the field. This was merely a feast delivered to their door. They ran through the swarm, gobbling, swallowing, their crops swelling with the bounty. They were tireless, efficient, a flock of 253 harvesting machines. Finn, who had been sent home by his father, had disobeyed and run back to Elspeth's farm, arriving terrified and breathless. He stood beside her on the porch, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and amazement. "They're eating them," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "They're eating the whole swarm." Not the whole swarm, of course, that was impossible. But they were carving out a perimeter of safety around the farmhouse. The grasshoppers that landed near the flock were consumed instantly. The plague was thickest at the edges of her property, but in the center, where the turkeys held court, the ground was almost clear. For 3 days, the twilight lasted. For 3 days, the noise never stopped, and for 3 days, the turkeys feasted. Elspeth and Finn worked to keep the water troughs full, a constant battle as the insects would fall into them and drown, fouling the water. When the swarm finally passed, lifting as suddenly as it had arrived, the silence it left behind was more shocking than the noise had been. The sun returned to a scene of biblical devastation. The valley was gone. The green rolling hills were a uniform sickly brown. Every field was a barren waste of gnawed stalks and stripped trees. It was a landscape of total loss. But on Elspeth's ridge, the ground was fertilized, the weeds were gone, and 253 very, very fat turkeys were sleeping off the biggest meal of their lives. The fortune of the entire county had been inverted in 72 hours. The men who had mocked her were ruined. Their assets were gone, their winter stores devoured, their banknotes due. And Elspeth, the town fool, was the only person left with anything of value. The shock in the valley curdled into despair. The men walked through their ruined fields like ghosts, touching the gnawed cornstalks, their faces blank with disbelief. The harvest was not just lost, it was annihilated. There would be no grain to sell, no feed for the livestock that had survived, no food to put on the table for the winter. Hunger, which had been a distant abstraction, was now a looming physical presence. It changed the air in the town, making it thin and sharp. It was in this atmosphere of quiet panic that Mr. Gable came to see Elspeth again. This time, he did not sit in his buggy. He walked up the path to her porch, his fine town coat smudged with dust, his face pale. The mask of smooth condescension was gone, replaced by a raw, naked urgency. He looked at her flock, at the birds so fat they could barely strut, and his eyes were the eyes of a starving man looking at a banquet. "Elspeth," he said, his voice hoarse. "A terrible tragedy, just terrible. The whole county wiped out." "Yes," she said. She was sitting on the porch steps, sharpening a small knife. The simple domestic act seemed to unnerve him. "My contracts are ruined," he went on, getting to the point. "The grain I was promised doesn't exist. I'm facing significant losses." He took a deep breath. "But there's an opportunity here, for you, for us. Those birds of yours, they're the only meat in 50 miles. There's a market in the capital, a desperate market. They'll pay any price for food right now." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "You can't manage a sale this big on your own. A woman alone, the logistics, the buyers, they'll cheat you. Let me handle it. I'll buy the whole flock from you, right now, cash." He named a price. It was a good price, more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to pay off the farm, buy new equipment, and live comfortably for years. It was a ticket out of the hardship she had known for so long. She looked from his desperate face to the valley below, where smoke rose from a few chimneys, the only sign of life in the brown wasteland. She thought of the faces in town, the tight, worried mouths of the women, the hollowed-out eyes of the men who had pitied her. They were hungry. Their children were hungry. Gable's plan was to take the food away, to sell it to the highest bidder in a distant city while his own neighbors starved. "You're a sharp woman, Elspeth," he pressed, mistaking her silence for calculation. "You know this is the best deal you'll ever get. One day, you're the town fool. The next, you're the richest woman in the county. It's a fine story." He smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. "Just say yes." She finished sharpening her knife, testing the edge with her thumb. She thought of the arithmetic she had been doing for months. The arithmetic of feed and weight, of taxes and debt. But there was another kind of arithmetic, one her grandfather had taught her, the arithmetic of community, of what a neighbor owes a neighbor. "How many birds are in that flock, Mr. Gable?" she asked, her voice quiet. He blinked, thrown by the question. "What? I don't know, 200? Does it matter?" "The last time you were here, you called them a foolishness. You never bothered to count," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I have 253. I know because I count them every morning and every night. How did you know the count to make your offer?" Gable's face went white. He had not made a guess. He had been watching. He had been counting her assets, waiting for his moment. His greed had made him careless. He had revealed his hand. It was not an offer of partnership. It was the move of a predator circling what he believed to be weakened prey. He had misread her language completely. The next morning, the town gathered at the crossroads by the general store. Word had spread that Gable had made Elspeth an offer, that the turkeys were to be sold. A crowd of silent, anxious people stood in the dust, their faces turned toward her ridge. They were there to watch their last hope be loaded into wagons and shipped away. They did not blame her. A person had a right to look after their own. They had mocked her, and fate had rewarded her. It was a bitter pill, but it was the way of the world. Just after dawn, 2 wagons rumbled down the road from her farm. One was hers, driven by young Finn, who sat straighter than a preacher on Sunday. The other was Old Man Hemlock's. Both were loaded with cages filled with turkeys. But they did not turn east toward the capital. They turned toward the town. Elspeth walked ahead of them, and she did not stop until she reached the crowd. Gable was there, standing near the front, a look of triumphant ownership already on his face. He believed she had come to accept his deal publicly. Elspeth walked past him and stood on the steps of the general store. The crowd was utterly silent. "Mr. Gable has made me an offer for my flock," she said, her voice clear and steady. It carried in the still air. "He offered to buy every bird, to take them to the city where he says they will fetch a high price." A low murmur went through the crowd. It was as they had feared. "It's a good offer," she continued, her eyes sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. She saw the blacksmith, Finn's father, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She saw the women she traded pleasantries with, their faces etched with worry. "But it's not the right offer." Gable took a step forward, his face darkening with anger. "Now, Elspeth, let's not be hasty." "The right offer," she cut him off, her voice gaining strength, "is the one that feeds this town." She turned to the crowd. "These birds are for sale, but they are for sale to you. I will sell 1 bird to each family for a price you can afford, enough to see you through the next month. We will set the price together, a fair price. The rest I will sell to the man from the capital to pay my own debts. But promise eats first." A wave of stunned silence washed over the people, followed by a surge of raw, overwhelming relief. It was a gift they had not dared to hope for. It was grace. Gable stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, his greed exposed in front of the entire community he sought to control. He had worked through mockery and condescension, and she had answered with quiet competence. He had tried to use the arithmetic of profit, and she had answered with the arithmetic of survival. He turned without a word and stalked away, his shame a palpable thing. No one watched him go. All eyes were on Elspeth. She was no longer the strange widow on the hill, the town's pitiable fool. She was the woman who had fed them. She had met their scorn with stillness, and now she met their desperation with generosity. She had learned to speak the language of the land, and now she was teaching them a new grammar of community. The sale took all day. There was no haggling. Elspeth, with Finn at her side acting as a proud clerk, simply asked what each family could fairly pay. Some paid with coin, others with promises of winter firewood, mending, or future labor. She accepted it all. Each transaction was a quiet affirmation, a mending of the frayed ties of the community. They were no longer just a collection of individuals struggling alone. They were a town, sharing a burden and a bounty. By evening, 100 families had been served. 100 cook fires sent the scent of roasting turkey into the twilight air, a smell of hope and sustenance that drove back the lingering stench of the plague. The next week, Silas, the carter, returned as promised. With him was a chef from the governor's hotel, a fussy man in a clean apron who took one look at the remaining flock, weighed a single bird in his hands, and offered Elspeth a price that made her breath catch. It was more than Gable had offered, and it was only for half of what was left. She sold him 60 birds, keeping the rest as her breeding stock for the next year. The money was enough. It was more than enough. The deed to her farm was now hers, free and clear. The arithmetic had finally balanced in her favor. With the immediate crisis over, the town began the slow work of rebuilding. The men who had once mocked her field now came to her for advice. They asked about the turkeys, about the soil, about the strange and patient wisdom she had shown. She spoke to them not with pride, but with the simple, direct language of the earth. She told them what she had learned by watching, by listening. She was no longer one person alone. She had found her voice, and it was a voice they were now eager to hear. Finn stayed on, her unofficial apprentice, his mind a sponge for her quiet knowledge. He was no longer the blacksmith's scrawny boy. He was Elspeth's right hand, a young man with a clear and certain purpose. One evening, as the first chill of autumn was creeping into the air, Elspeth stood with Old Man Hemlock by the fence, watching her remaining flock forage in the recovering field. The birds, fat and content, moved through the new green shoots that were sprouting from the fertilized soil.
The land was healing. "The land does not waste, Elspeth," Hemlock said, the words as comfortable as an old coat. She looked at the thriving birds, at the grateful town in the valley below, at the solid feel of the deed in her pocket. She had taken the thing no one wanted, the land everyone pitied, and she had listened to what it needed. She had turned scorn into abundance, not through magic, but through patience and observation. "No," she said, a true smile gracing her lips for the first time in a long time. "Only men do." The world was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of dread, but the silence of peace, a deep and earned contentment that settled over the ridge and the valley, a quiet promise of the seasons to come.